Hello, everyone. Dear students, dear colleagues, dear non-UCSC audience members, thank you so much for coming here tonight and to share the honor of having Terike Haapoja here at UCSD with me. I'm really excited to have her here. I've had an artist crush on Terike's work for like a decade now. The first time I encountered her work was at ISCP in New York. We were in the same exhibition, and I saw her work, and I was really stunned by the sharp intellect behind it, but also the level of aesthetic sensibility. It really, resonated with me, the work. And fast forward 2 years, I was in Moss, Norway, to participate in Momentum Biennial, the Nordic Biennial. And, after the opening, of course, the installation is over. There's time to walk around and check other artworks. I walked into an empty movie theater, and totally empty. There was a sound installation there. So I sat, and I'm like enjoying this sound installation. And this petite, gorgeous lady sat next to me. And we started talking, and it turns out it was Terike. So I was like, oh, I have an artist crush on you. So it was kind of awkward, but it worked fine because she's here now. Terike is a very established artist. She's represented Finland in the 55th Venice Biennial with a solo show in the Nordic Pavilion. And she's been awarded an Anti Prize for Live Art in 2016, a Ducati Prize in 2008, and an Ars Fenica Prize nomination. Her collaboration with writer Laura Gustafsson was honored with a Finnish State Media Art Award in 2016 and the Kilo Prize in 2013. She's the co-editor of the publications The Helsinki Effect, Public Alternatives to Guggenheim's Model of Culture-Driven Development, and Altern Ecologies, Emergent Perspectives on the Ecological Threshold in the 55th Venice Biennial. Together with History According to Cattle and Field Notes from Landscape to Laboratory, published by the Finnish BioArt Society in 2011, among others. Of course, she gives talks and lectures internationally, and she's in New York. She lives in New York. You don't live in Finland, although you travel there. So I'll leave you to Terike. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Pinar. I have to say the artist crush is mutual, so we're happily colleagues. I'm really happy to be here. Thanks so much for inviting. It's been really nice. Also, there's palm trees. It's warm. New York is just starting to be really horrible. So I think this should be about 45 minutes or something, and I'm happy to to have a conversation afterwards. So if you have something in mind, please, keep it in your mind until we can have the Q&A. Yeah, okay. So, and I'll just run through several projects and try to kind of open up the thinking behind that. I start from the work that's on show here in the gallery and end up with a new work that's outside the gallery. And I think it's been actually really nice to think about that 15-year time span between those two series of works, and how they connect thematically. Entropy is the second law of thermodynamics, and that describes the increase of disorder in the universe. It also shows the arrow of time. Entropic processes are irreversible. Entropy, the work on show in the gallery, shows the gradual cooling down of a horse's body recorded with a heat-sensitive infrared camera. In the work, a recording of 9 hours is edited to a 25-minute loop. In the video, one can see how the figure of the horse slowly vanishes as its body loses its heat. Now, one can look at this work through notions of scientific representations and what they tell us about the world. We're accustomed to think that science, to make a massive generalization, ideally approaches the world in objective terms. So devices like an infrared camera are able to show a reality that escapes our subjective and limited sensory apparatus. And yes, the image does reveal something, but it also covers up another reality. The particularity and individuality of this animal is replaced by the generalized, the symbolic, the metaphorical. The gaze, or you can even say the paradigm of looking, creates the other as a thing, an object, or an image object in this case. However, there are phenomena that cannot be approached by the means of objectivity, one of them being consciousness that we can never see from any outside position. Yet this experiential internality, the fact that it is like something to be someone, is perhaps one of the most common phenomena in the world. This internality is the foundation, of course, of ethics and underlies any ethical encounter, gives it its gravity. We're not only things in the worlds of others, but also world-carrying worlds in ourselves. All these thoughts about science and knowledge came later, after finishing the piece. My original motivation was much more personal, much more urgent and demanding. I was searching for a way to process the experience of feeling the body of my own mother cool down, slowly and inevitably, after her passing away. This experience was like an earthquake in the stability of how I trusted the world to be. What was so mysterious to me was the disappearance, that was invisible from the outside. She was still there, but in all relevant ways she was gone, sinking out of reach. Instead of using this cold technology for revealing something invisible to the eye, something of the physical reality, I attempted to reverse the scientific attitude in order to reveal something of the emotional reality. To me, the work is a kind of a wake, a meditation on the impossibility to really understand what takes place in death. Of course, while showing the work nowadays, it has become resonant also to the question of mourning in the face of mass extinctions and the endangerment of future as such. In any case, what takes place here is a mystery, but one that is so ordinary and so common that we tend to forget that it's a mystery. How can beings emerge as subjects who don't only live in a world, but who also possess a world, and then disappear into being things? This is a question that has haunted me through most of my work in different ways. How do beings become things and things become beings? Another threshold between subjectivity and objecthood is, of course, birth. We can't access the moment of transformation from object to subjecthood with knowledge, because knowledge is always on this side of consciousness, on the side of agency, on the side of subjectivity, at least for us humans. Art then, and also other rituals, can be ways for relating to that which we cannot directly comprehend, but that nonetheless are an integral part of our lives. Mind over matter over mind, of which you see one part in the gallery, shows a 3D ultrasound portrait of a 20-week-old fetus, extremely slowed down. In this video work, this is a very bad picture, but the work is there, so you can go see it later. In this work, I focused on the distortions in the original image that seem to reproduce the failure of technology in properly depicting what experientially happens, while resulting in a constant metamorphosis between a recognizable baby to something that resembles a death mask or a monster. These are stills from the video. After working on these pieces, I wanted to put so-called cold scientific media to use, but not for representing and creating objects and things, but for creating interfaces of interaction and communication. In some ways, I wanted to allow life again to emerge on the stage of my own work. Closed circuit open duration is a kind of a garden-like installation space that consists of 7 different works that form a whole, where the macro landscape and the micro detail shift in focus. I showed this first in 2008, so many of these questions have actually mainstreamed after that. Also technologically, a lot has happened, and scientifically a lot has happened since then. But these images are from the 2013 iteration in the Venice Biennale. While working on this exhibition, I was interested in empirical science-based devices like CO2 sensors that tend to reduce the object of knowledge to its measurable elements, while everything else, or at least much of the else, falls outside the systems of knowledge into the realm of para-knowledge, parasites of knowledge, and so on. Still, like Donna Haraway, Bruno Latour, and many others remind us, the dualist worldview of nature on one side and culture on the other doesn't really capture the ways in which our lives are entangled together. Donna Haraway's famous notion, nature cultures, attempts to bring in language that could capture this entanglement in a better way. So I wanted to use methods for scientific research, but not for harvesting data, but for interaction and translation between the human and the non-human. Working closely with researchers from environmental research and more specifically forest atmosphere studies of carbon flows, I worked on pieces that were kind of DIY appropriations of their methods. And these are just general overviews of the exhibition space, of the kind of landscapey environment. And here's one of the works called Dialogue, which is a playful work that enables human-tree communication through a complex circuit that consists of biochemical, digital, analog, light, and sound signals. So you talk or breathe to this very clumsy-looking sensor, and in a short while, the trees respond by whistling, making, communicating back. Another work, and here you can see the devices that I designed based on the devices of the carbon flow researchers, the environmental researchers, making work on pine forests in Finland. So what happens is that the little box opens and closes, and then there's a measuring device that measures the fixing of the carbon inside the box. Another piece, Inhale, Exhale, which is the kind of coffin-sized box here, is an attempt to internalize what carbon flow actually means. I encountered the concept of soil respiration that I thought was really, really poetic and beautiful. And of course, soil respiration is an important phenomenon in terms of climate change research, while melting of permafrost is a big problem. But also, I was really fascinated by the idea that the soil, the earth, breathes out this carbon that's been fixed in these different organisms' bodies. And I started to think of our own bodies and how our own bodies are part of the carbon cycle. And how could we actually think of those processes as something that are integrally part of our own lives and our own mortality, and not only something that have to do with nature somewhere out there. And Inhale, Exhale is a coffin-sized case of soil and dead leaves. And inside, what happens inside the soil, of course, is decomposing. And so a lot of carbon is released to the atmosphere or to the air. There's a ventilation system that opens and closes the box in a 30-second intervals. So when the ventilation is closed, the CO2 level starts to go rapidly up, and when it's open, it starts to go down, and then this is measured and then made audible. So when you approach the box, it sort of makes this very low frequency breathing sound of like, in order to kind of just try to get an understanding of what that would mean experientially for us. The piece behind the coffin is called Succession, and it's a very simple piece. There's a lot of work that's been done after this, kind of after the mainstreaming of the notion of human microbiome. But this was a kind of playful test on that. So I just pressed my face on a cultivation platform and saw what's growing there, and then what's growing, I just recorded it for almost a week. And what you can see here is not microscopic, so there are finger-sized colonies of bacteria that starts to emerge. And of course, I was thinking of the notion of the human body as an ecosystem, or that we can think of ourselves as superorganisms instead of individuals, and what that actually then means to our ethics and also our relationship to the non-human world. And then community is the final version of the infrared series, of which the Entropy piece is the first one. And this consists of 5 different recordings of different animals, all in the durations are not edited in this one. And I was thinking of community when I was working on the piece and saw how people would gather around these pools of images of animals that are slowly kind of sinking into this nothingness or this death. And remembered Giorgio Agamben talking about community and thinking of like what would be the widest notion of community, and proposing that maybe it's the community of living that's the widest notion of how we can think of community. So death is the ultimate boundary. I don't know if that's so. I don't know even if I think of that being so, but that's the name of the piece. So I'm thinking of community as the community of the living, but also referring to mass extinctions and also the way in which the death of non-human species is the foundation of human communities. And of course, you can now think of, for example, the way in which we're waking up to the fact that the burning of the Amazon is a result of animal agriculture and beef cattle farming. And just to give a reference, I think 41% of the US land is reserved for cattle farming, animal agriculture. So that's an incredible amount of land that actually sustains human civilization. And of course, not necessarily, but it's a political choice. And here are the animals. But there is one place where nature and culture as two separate fields are actually a hard reality. Our understanding of law doesn't recognize nature cultures, but instead divides the world into two separate fields. This is a central divide in law is that of persons and things. Persons are, of course, humans and human-made constructs such as universities or states or corporations. Things being everything else, including nature and other species. Law, then, is a kind of a biopolitical mechanism that divides bodies into those within the field of rights and those outside rights. And this reminds of the question that Hannah Arendt posed, that the question of who has the right to have rights is the most fundamental ethical question. In Western traditions and in how we think of democracy, political community is normally seen as the community of language users. To have a say, to be able to voice one's concerns, to vote. But only certain kind of notion of language is accepted. Language that has syntax, grammar. So the languages of non-human animals, or those whose languages are not understood, or those humans who are silent, think of children or disabled people in the history, are left outside of consideration. However, it's clear now that a system that excludes majority of the world's beings is not sustainable in the face of the climate crisis, not also sustainable in the face of justice. So what would be a political community that was not exclusive, that would include everybody who is present, including the non-human realm? What would its structure of governance be like? I didn't know this, so I went to ask politicians, activists, lawyers, philosophers, and got different kinds of answers. From these answers, I constructed an exhibition that examines the language of politics, or language as the first structure of exclusion from a political community. In the exhibition, you can hear the individual interviews from the speakers, and then in the background, you can see how a certain political consensus is starting to form, how the topics that we're discussing are debating against each other. I asked the interviewers to use the words they and them instead of animals and nature in order to underline the similarities to other emancipation struggles in the history. So they would talk about what should be done with them, what do they want, what is good for them. But also to demonstrate the possessiveness. So also to demonstrate the possessiveness of a system that relies on those on the inside to speak on behalf of the ones that are excluded. This was in 2011, which was also the year that the right-wing populists gained their first parliamentary election victory in Finland. So as a response to the xenophobic language of the far right at the time, I launched the Party of Others as a real political alternative, a political party that would represent the others. In other words, all those who are excluded from decision-making. Mainly focusing on non-human species, but also pointing towards the historic exclusion of different groups of people, whose rights, of course, were already again threatened. I wrote the party's agenda based on the interviews and launched a publicity campaign for registering the party to the political party register. The campaign got a lot of visibility, though not enough votes. In Finland, you need 5,000 signatures in order to register your party to the political party register. And one of the reasons I didn't push for it was that the political situation at the time was so urgent. There was so much stakes that I didn't want to throw in my artistic project that could actually potentially ridicule actual green alternatives and social justice alternatives, while then taking away even few votes of those who believed in this kind of deep ecological party politics, because obviously this party would not be able to make it to the parliament. But so the polarity that was only a fracture in the political landscape at the time is a massive void nowadays, as we know, with leftist political ecology, rights of nature discourses, and demands for decolonization on one side, and white supremacist nationalist movements on the other. In the end, I think what the void represents is a battle over a fundamental question of democracy. Who has rights to have rights? Who belongs or even can belong to we the people? Museum of Non-Humanity is a project by me and my longtime collaborator, the writer Laura Gustafsson. And you can see some of the work in the screens outside the gallery in the hallway. In this project, we decided to take on the challenge to investigate deeper what do we really mean when we talk about non-humanity. In post-humanist and animal rights discourses, non-humanity seems to refer simply to a species divide. We humans on the other side and all the other species, together with all other stuff of the world on the other. But when you look closer, you see that the boundary is unstable and also ungrounded. Museum of Non-Humanity is a touring memorial museum. We've so far been in Helsinki in Norway, Italy, Taiwan, the UK, and we're going back to Helsinki next year. Its exhibit is in the form of a 11-channel, 70-minute video installation that consists solely of quotes, encyclopedia entries, archival images, and dictionary entries from the 2,000 years of Western thoughts. The material demonstrates, through these topics listed here, how humanity has been distinguished from non-humanity in the course of Western thought through different rhetorical and philosophical devices. In Museum of Non-Humanity, we focused specifically on one version of this divide, the human-animal divide. And what the archive makes clear is that this divide is not a biological divide based on any biological or physical difference, but a moral and juridical divide that's function is simply to make beings of any species killable. The question of the animal is in fact two questions. One is a question of the human-animal divide and how it's constructed. The other question is our relationship to concrete, literal other species. And of course, the first, the way in which we conceptualize humanity and animality informs also the latter. First, maybe actually I should, well, I'll run these in the background and talk. Yeah, I guess it works. So first, animal is not an ecological concept. There's nothing in our species that categorically distinguishes us from all the other species, nor there is any characteristics that all the other species would share. We humans, the Homo sapiens, are just one species amongst many. Then why do we use the word animal so casually, as if it was a real thing? It's widely understood in the post-humanist discourses that because humans are in fact animals, they have had to make themselves human by rejecting their own animal being. Since Aristotle, who defined a hierarchy between beings already over 2,000 years ago, a hierarchy in which humanity is different and most importantly superior to all other beings because of its unique ability for rationality, the Western thought has been obsessed with human exceptionalism. The philosopher Giorgio Agamben describes this process in his book The Open, Man and Animal, where he traces different variations of the attempt to separate humanity proper from the underlying animal body. Whether it's rationality, work, language, tool-making, or even art, in this tradition, humanity is always something that is laid over the animal body. Aristotle's thinking was influenced by the ancient Greek notion of zoe as the basic form of life that is in common to all living beings. Plants have it, animals have it, humans have it, versus bios as the proper way of political living that is accessible only to humans as rational animals. And variations of this divide can be found throughout Western history, from theology to early biology to philosophy. Agamben calls this historical process the anthropological machine, a process at the core of Western thought that tries to ceaselessly separate humanity from its animal foundation. This process is lethal. Because of what he calls the caesura between the animal body and the layer of humanity, anyone at any given time can be stripped of their humanity and reduced to the underlying zoe, bare life. Thus, the camp, the internment camp, the extermination camp, where anything is possible in full daylight, is already latently present in any Western formation of democracy, simply because of the way in which humanity is conceptualized. The divide has, of course, been constructed by the ruling elite, namely the white European male, in order to call anyone who is different from them lesser human. Therefore, the logic of the human-animal divide is the condition of possibility for all forms of oppression, racism, sexism, xenophobia, and so on, that are based on dehumanizing the othered in order to justify violence against them. Agamben, however, is not interested in the literal non-human animals. He's also critiqued because of the way in which he overlooks race in the formation of the human-animal divide. My own current thinking has been affected by the likes of Silko, who's the co-author of Aphorism, or Che Gosset, another scholar, who advanced this conversation by taking into account race and the scholarship that grows out of African diaspora and black feminism and black radical traditions that have for centuries built arguments against the Eurocentric notion of human. What Silko argues is that we have to think about humanity and animality specifically in the context of coloniality and within the paradigm of race that encompasses the world globally today. Her argument is that the historical human-animal binary was radically transformed in the wake of the colonization of the Americas and the transatlantic slave trade that followed. The sociologist Ramon Grossfogel writes about how when Spanish colonists encountered the indigenous people of Americas, they failed to understand them as fully human, for they didn't seem to have religion, something that was considered essential to any human in European imagination at the time. So the idea of humans that are animal-like soon developed into a widespread debate. Even if the word race was not used at that time, what was born was race as hierarchies within the figure of human, hierarchies of humanness. So the binary opposite of human proper was thus no longer the literal non-human animal, but the subhuman, the racialized other. And during the transatlantic slave trade, blackness became a signifier of this fundamentally white, suprematist, colonial notion of humanity and subhumanity. What Silko argues, and I agree on, is that just as the subhuman, so-called subhuman, is racialized through animalization, in other words, through its assumed proximity to the animal, also the literal non-human animals are animalized through racialization, in other words, through their assumed proximity to the so-called subhuman. The figures of both animal and subhuman serve as the binary opposite and foundation to this white suprematist, patriarchal, Eurocentric, colonial notion of human proper. Thus, anti-racism should include alliance with non-human animals and vice versa, because both are animalized through the same mechanism. The political community in the Western political theory is founded on a divide that requires othering of those deemed non-human. Thus, the logic of animality, in other words, that we have a category of animals that legitimizes violence, makes it possible for anyone at any given time to be pushed outside the protections of humanity and be treated like an animal. And we all know what that means. When we now return to the question of who can belong to we the people, we can see that the exclusion of the natural world, nature and animals from the political community is not a different question from the exclusion of racialized and excluded groups of humans. It's also not a coincidence that what we see is an intensification of white supremacist nationalist violence as a reaction to challenging this order, as a reaction to the demands for decolonizing the political landscape and demolishing that toxic hierarchy. It's not a coincidence that white men attack Greta Thunberg, for example. It's not a coincidence that they attack feminists, indigenous people, environmentalists, and those fighting for racial justice. Just briefly, this exhibition also includes always a discursive space, this is a vegan cafe where we hosted seminars and discussions and conversations and panels that try to bring these questions together and think of what would be a world beyond animality. So beyond animality is, for me, the starting point more than post-human or post-humanity. Following this analysis, it may be possible to say that industrial animal agriculture is indeed one of the variations of a camp. That it's a space where anything can happen and happens in full daylight. Now can I have the sound, please? Animality is for me... You can just... Yeah, I think it's the wrong track. It's fine. Thank you. Waiting Room is a sound installation that presents an immersive one-to-one scale sound ambience of the waiting room of a slaughterhouse, where pigs are held for one night before being brought to slaughter. In the back room, we're starting to build an archive that expands from the words terror and terrorism and maps out the ways in which the state legitimizes forms of violence and labels challenging them terrorism. Think of animal rights activism as terrorists, or recent charges against Dakota Access Pipeline activists or environmental activists, but also abolitionist or prison abolitionist activists in history. It's important to connect the dots and understand that the structural and ideological mechanisms behind making killable and how they are not separate from each other. We live in a paradigm where beings are constantly made into things, and things like corporations that possess legal personhood and are thus made legally, in many cases untouchable, are made beings. This is not a theoretical process, or in other words, conceptualization always has a function, has power, and violence is always preceded by conceptualization as a justification. So vulnerability is never an abstraction. Therefore, to only talk and think about these questions that are fundamentally about the vulnerability of beings, ourselves included, in theory, would lead us farther from these issues, as if it was possible to investigate something like this objectively. In other words, as if we didn't have bodies ourselves. Some years ago, I was diagnosed with a serious illness, cancer, and right after I left an unhealthy relationship. In this extreme state of vulnerability, I resorted to making images in order to process what I was going through. I didn't intend them for art audiences, but instead started to post them on a fetish site me and my ex-lover used to hang out. While my vulnerability was suddenly so real, so life-threatening, the imaginary of the fetish scene became more problematic with its eroticized fantasies of domination and suffering. The photo series Gravitation eventually became a book and a photo series that I do show in art contexts that helped me to shift my practice and also anchor these questions back to the experiential reality. Art is a weird line of work, I think, because in many ways you have to work with what life brings to you. The work in the series Habeas Corpus that I'm showing for the first time here at the gallery is an attempt to continue with this process and expand the personal approach of gravitation towards the themes of law, corporeality, race, and animality through a more intuitive approach. Vulnerability is also the way so vulnerability is something I've been thinking of a lot recently, and it's also the way in which we connect with the world. It's how the world gets to us, both physically and emotionally. I've recently thought of vulnerability also as an ability to be open to the world, to let things get to you, to let yourself be moved and touched by things. This ability is something that opens in specific circumstances, most often, of course, in the intimacy with another person, whose witness gives shelter and allows one to expose oneself safely. But in my experience, the intimacy between the artist and their work also opens up a space for vulnerability. That's not so different from the one that opens in intimate relationships. For the artist, work is not really work, but more like a friend. And work becomes the witness, the shelter that makes it possible to express and go deep. I find that cultivating this relationship, this intimacy with your work, is the most important thing for an artist to learn. Everything else is built on that. And this is because the political, the theory, is never about the abstract. In the end, everything comes back to the body, to how we are here with others. Our own vulnerability connects us with others and also makes it possible for us to understand what is at stake for others. And here, in the world, whether we encounter others as beings or as things means everything. Thank you. And there's a reading copy of the Museum of Non-Humanity book, which consists of the whole archive of the project and some other material if you want. You can also order it from Punctum Books or download as a free e-book copy.
All right. So what we're going to do right now is we have some more time, and I'll ask maybe 2 questions of my own to Terike while she's here, and I'll open the ground for further questions by you. So this is a good time to maybe absorb all this rich material and think about your own thoughts a little bit. Are you going to run for presidency?
I was thinking of that, but I think the position is corrupted. I don't think anyone wants to do that anymore after this one that's running now.
Really? Yeah. Technically, you can't run for presidency here.
Oh, I can. I'm a citizen.
You are?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Then maybe you should really consider doing this.
Yeah, I will. Thank you.
But aside from joke, the party of others and the reason you stopped, it's very interesting. What were your, how close did you come to actually doing it? Like you said 5,000 people were needed. How many people were you able to, gather?
Yeah, well, I mean, in the hundreds, maybe in 1,000 something, but not, we didn't. In the end, I decided to not really campaign. Also because the party, we always had the rhetorics of talking that the party does this and the party's opinion is this, and it's like this whole front of an institution that you put up. But in reality, it's just me and my dog. So we also had like a very limited resources to actually do anything. But I'm working on I'm trying to think around a new iteration of the project for the 2020 elections here in the US, because I think the question is really even more relevant now than it was back then. And because the same divide that you kind of saw emerging, like the white nationalism on the other side and then rights of nature on the other, was really small then, but now both these polarities are really, really dramatic. So I think it's a really, really important question. But the thing that I'm kind of trying to work around is that it doesn't really make sense to deconstruct or try to critique the problems in Western democracy when there's so much relevant knowledge that comes from indigenous scholarship and indigenous traditions and non-Western traditions that exist. So I don't think we have time to kind of like try to kind of pick apart Western, failed attempts to build something, but we should just actually like put all our efforts into trying to figure out how can we support traditions and initiatives that grow out of non-Western traditions.
That's already existing, and that's already been proven to work.
Yeah. So in a way, like when I was asking with the Party of Others, when I was asking them, how could you include the non-humans in this system? That's based actually, that's the whole foundation of which is based on the exclusion of non-humans, wherever that is. It's a paradox. You can't, of course you can't. But so now I'm thinking like we should just turn it wholly around and ask non-Western traditions, how could they imagine including all this like fucked up stuff outside in the West? How could we be part of that?
I was thinking about, a lot of things kind of struck me when I was listening to you. This was wonderful, very poetic also. But I was thinking about how you said language as one of the first levels of exclusion, right? And then it brought to mind this new development, the Wanganui River in New Zealand becoming a legal person. And next to it, a forest is also becoming a legal person. So what are your thoughts on these developments in New Zealand?
Well, I think a lot of those rights of nature initiatives grow out of places where there's a strong indigenous representation. So they kind of grow like in Ecuador or Bolivia or in New Zealand. They grow out of notions of like very holistic notions of how the society is built, and that actually the human communities are really bound and the same as the non-human entities. So the rights of the river are the rights of the people, and that's it. But then there's also, so I think definitely that's super relevant and necessary to push for that. And there's like, it's much more radical than just thinking that we could include those. I think it's like, it would lead to much more dramatic deconstruction of how we think of law and legality and community than it looks from the surface. So it's not really about just like including non-humans to existing system, but it's really a lot about transforming the whole system to a much more holistic way of thinking. There's also other approaches like the Non-Human Rights Project, that's a New York-based non-profit that fights for recognition of the personhood of non-human individuals, such as chimpanzees that are captivated in research facilities, and elephants, like the elephant in the Bronx Zoo. And so they're focusing on their argument is that they're just trying to expand the notion of personhood, and they start from the idea that's central to how personhood is understood in like Western legal systems, is that autonomy is really central, that the creatures that are autonomous should be protected by this idea of personhood, or this construct of personhood, or included in this notion of personhood, based on that they're autonomous. And so what should be protected is autonomousness and not a species, because autonomousness, similar to humans, can be found in all sorts of different creatures. So that's why they're first fighting for creatures like, or beings like chimpanzee or gorillas or orcas or elephants that are cognitively very similar to humans, and it's easy or possible to prove that they're actually, like, in their social needs and in their intellect, they're very similar. But it's a very different approach, because it's kind of like just based on this idea of it doesn't question the the norm being this individual, rational, white, male, Western figure being in the center of like what is valued and what's the norm, while these rights of nature discourses do actually question that. So I think they're like very much about decolonization, while these others are more about just expanding this system so that it could include more people.
Right.
People.
Great. Well, so it's good to hear that you're running your party for 2020, because I'm going to run mine as well.
Good.
Like, I have this AI cat that's also governor or something. So
Okay,
meet you next year.
Yeah, we can form an alliance.
Yes, we can definitely form. Yeah, mine is a non-human agent, so it totally fit. Yeah, we can look for funding bodies together. Now, at this point, I have so many other questions, and I have the microphone, but I would like to ask you what your questions are. This is a time for me to ask you. What are your questions? And we have a microphone over there. If you don't want to walk up to that, we don't have staff members. They'll bring the microphone to you, so you will actually have to walk up to that. But yeah, this is a very, good, intimate crowd, so. Yes.
Can you talk a bit about the relationship, the choice of media that you use to make your work has to the concerns that you have in yours? I don't know that.
Could you
I
hear
think
it?
I heard. Yeah.
Yeah. So the basically the choice of displaying language or words as a projection on the wall, or the choice of using the infrared technology, all being different technologies. I just wanted to hear from you, like, what's the relationship that has to the concerns that you have in your practice?
Could everyone hear the question? Yeah? Yeah? Okay.
Thank you for that. Well, I for a long time when I was still studying and working, I had a very kind of problematic relationship with image making. I couldn't really I studied theater and I was studying lighting design, and I was supposed to make images, and I just couldn't, because I was really thinking three-dimensionally. I was always thinking spatially. And so Entropy is actually the first work that I did that was two-dimensional in that sense, that I felt like it kind of I kind of got how the media worked. And that's because I was interested in the materiality of the media, and how it's it becomes this almost tangible material surface through which you can transform something to something else. But I never kind of could think of media as this window of telling a story or a narrative or something like that. And I think I think of language a little bit in similar way, that language is a medium of thought, and that while thinking or renewing language, we can also kind of renew how we can think of the world, and that's kind of very important to how I think about things. Also because my collaboration is with an author, Laura Gustafsson, so language, and we work in dialogue, so that becomes a big part of how we think, is how do we think through language. But yeah, so I think I guess I think of media, I kind of consider myself coming from media arts background, but I think of media in this widest possible way. So we've done works that are museums, not only this museum, but we did one project that's the Museum of the History of Cattle, which is the world's first ethnographic museum showing world history from bovine perspective. And it's a full-size ethnographic museum, and I consider that museum as a medium, that whole tradition to be something that I'm really interested in. And that what interests me in that is how you can make things real. So for example, when you build a museum, that's your medium of creating something, it also becomes the real thing. It also becomes the museum, and it doesn't just represent things. So that's also what happens with the Party of Others. It's the political party as a medium, but also as the real thing, not just mediating something, but also transforming. And also what I think is interesting in this appropriations of social forms is that when you, for example, when we did the Museum of History of Cattle, and maybe especially here with the Museum of Non-Humanity, it sort of transforms the world into a place where non-humanity is put in a museum. it's like it kind of like reflects back to the world in a way that I find really, really interesting and empowering in a way, because it kind of shows that, oh, we could just think differently. We could just exist in a world where we conceptualize things in a whole different way. And then people come into those spaces and they're like, okay, yeah, I can think like this. There's no problem, you know. And this is like because we, you know, these institutions and ways of thinking and languages, language being also one institution, is like they are like pathways for us to exist and think and conceptualize the world. And if we have different kinds of pathways, we can think differently. And in some way, I think of these appropriations of social forms like the party or the museum as ways of like somehow showing, not only, it's not that would actually, I mean, some things came out of the party of others, like now there's an animal rights party, and I think it kind of made room for thinking outside of like this very anthropocentric politics. But that's not really the function, like the radicality. I think the radicality is that it makes it possible for us to experientially understand that it's possible to have a whole different way of being politically in the world, that it's not far out, it's just like it's possible, we could just do it. And that kind of experiential, well, now I'm venturing off, but anyway, I don't like, I find it problematic to work with installations like this Museum of Non-Humanity has been invited to biennales, like in Momentum Biennale, and it always takes something away from the power of it. I much more like to show things independently, where you can activate that potential. So there's also the thing in which art really like numbs the potential of art to do things in the world, you know.
I couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
I guess that's so true. Well, any other questions you might have, dear audience?
I have a question about consciousness. So in thinking about Between Thingness and Being, I wondered if you'd come across the work Incomplete Nature by Terence Deacon, which is about kind of addressing the mystery of the origin of consciousness from a neuroscience perspective. If not, I was curious what you might suggest reading along those subjects, if that was something that you had done during the process of working on that, and if you felt like consciousness was a naturally emergent property of sort of the chemical and geological forces extant in the universe, or you feel it has a more spiritual origin.
Well, I'm actually not like, that's kind of not where my work is at the moment, so I'm not really on top of the literature or research on that field, so I can't really give you like a smart answer on that. I think you probably are much smarter on that than I am. I mean, the only thing I can say is that I have a strong intuition that consciousness is something that's all over in different forms, and that we only have this very local knowledge of it. But also that we wouldn't understand, if we saw a brain on the table, we wouldn't have any idea that whatever it does has anything to do with consciousness if we didn't have the first-hand experience of consciousness. So the kind of just this inability to, or impossibility to get outside of that experiential subjectivity, which I think is something that when you start to think that this would be something that's all over in different creatures in different ways, exists in different forms. Of course, it changes the ethical conversations really, really a lot. And I think it's like, I think of ethical conversations as like we're thrown into the world, and we have this ethical. We kind of like, we have to think ethically. We're always trying to figure out like, how should we live here? But there's no answer. But we still have to keep trying to figure it out. And I guess the question of consciousness is always really important. But many times, like people, when I talk about animality, people kind of bring in the question of plant consciousness, and I think also it's important to like not mix things in a way that's unproductive to the ethical discourse. So, for example, when you think about animalization as like something that's really, really deeply entangled with racialization and sexism and xenophobia and like the kind of like real violence, human violence, then to bring in the question of plant rights or plant consciousness is like watering down the actual stakes that are at place. And it doesn't mean that the question wouldn't be relevant about plant consciousness, but you kind of like, you have to think of like where do you talk about which things in a way that is constructive. It's constructive to actually trying to build a more exclusive way of thinking of ethics, and not that, okay, well, everything's suffering, so we don't care. You know, so that's, I guess, yeah, I probably didn't answer, but. Yeah.
Any other questions?
Hi. So this is not like I guess it's kind of like a general question I have been like thinking about a lot recently. Actually was by like a friend, because like his professor kind of like posed this question to the class. It's like imagine yourself as sort of like a curator or like a organizer for art that can have access to different museums in a city, you know, like a major, for example, like a European city. And then you're in charge of this, like maybe a group of, let's see, like African masks. And what kind of museums would you put it in? Would it be, you know, like a historical museum, cultural museum, like a heritage museum, or like art museum? I guess, yeah, just something like, I'm kind of curious, how would you respond to that, just based on what you have talked about in your work? So yeah.
Wow, yeah, that's a big one. Well, I guess I can't really answer that personally, because I've never been like assigned a task like that, and I'm not in a position to actually, you know, think through those questions in that way. But I mean, the way in which we approach this in the Museum of Non-Humanity was that, of course, when you do anything that's a museum, you also bring in the colonial history of what is a museum and how the whole, you know, apparatus has started from, you know, curiosities from colonized countries and all the violence that's been involved in the systems of knowledge within museums, and is still very actively kind of perpetuated through these museums. And so I definitely think that systems of knowledge, sites of knowledge like museums, should be like dramatically decolonized and really thought through. I don't actually even know whether, like, I really believe in art, but I also like really believe that museums are, as sites, are like they're like democracy, or like, I don't know, like political Western political theory, like they're corrupt from the beginning. How do you reconstruct something that you actually have to demolish the whole thing and then build something new? And that's a longer process than doing it like this year, or like in my lifetime or something like that. So I think, like, I mean, there's a lot of activism around. Maybe you followed, like in New York, with the Warren Kanders thing at the Whitney, and the Sacklers, and now MoMA, and a lot of these museums are being targeted and being really challenged by way of, you know, asking them to be something else than safe havens for like tax evasion and blood money, basically, or PR wings of this global financial elite. And I think it's really good and really right, but I think there's also limits to like what can museums actually be places where we can do work that's meaningful, that's actually based on some totally different idea of cultural exchange and dialogue and showing things or representing things. And I don't know what that could be, but yeah, I can't answer that specific question.
I think this was a great answer already. No? You can just write that back as to the professor, and that's going to be like, wow, yeah. Any other burning questions? Because I have one if you don't have one. Well, here's my question then. Waiting for 3 more seconds. Okay. Terike, this is something that I ask all my curator and artist friends who have been working at this intersection of art, science, technology, and the Anthropocene. And honestly, now that you've been in this field for a long time as well, and you are a highly accomplished artist. You've shown in, very high-profile places, so let's say the art world and the art institutions from inside. You've installed, you've met the people, etc. And let's say a decade ago, we didn't have Instagram campaigns about plastic killing birds, or let's say, the climate strikes we're having today. Things are changing. And also we see some of this kind of pouring over to the art world. Now the institutions seem more open to artists who work with ecology, because there was a time where this was super fringe and you'd never sell work because you're talking about plastic pollution in the ocean, or, you know, cattle, like that won't sell, right? So now being in this, I think, long enough, and as a keen observer, like, what are your thoughts on where, you know, the art trends are going, and where these more mainstream, you know, art institutions and mainstream curators are going? Because, I mean, honestly, these become signs of success for our students, people who study art or who want to be artists. Those are the places that people look up to because they're so visible. So what are your thoughts on this? Like, is it changing?
Well, yeah, of course, it's definitely changing. Like, this is a big, of course, there's like so many Anthropocene exhibitions, and ecology is like a big thing. And I kind of feel that it's not something that's going to be a trend in the same way as some other trends have been, because the urgency is not going to go anywhere. It's going to just get worse. So I think it's going to be more and more of a trend just because it's more and more present in everybody's life, and we can't avoid it because it's the most massive political and massive challenge that the world has experienced ever. So in that sense, then the question is like, well, and I believe in art, and I believe in like the transformative power and the radical power of art to be like essential for that transformation to some kind of a different kind of society. Not only political art, not only ecological art, but art as a way of like doing basic research and thinking about other ways of thinking, talking about other ways of talking, like doing this whole work of like renewing our way of being in the world. So in that sense, probably like art institutions and sites for art making and showing will be present. But then at the same time, like, I just feel like, I mean, I'm just so skeptical about the whole value system of our art world. And there is like, I think it also has to do with age a little bit. Like, I'm 44, and I feel like at some point, like when you're younger, you kind of look up and you're like, I want to be in these places and do these things. And then when you get closer, you just see the hollowness of the whole thing. And then, of course, in the face of everything that's happening politically in the world, you just have to question, like, are these the values that make any sense? Like, how can I think of the value of art making and the notion of success in some other ways of like, I got a show in MoMA? Like, who cares? Like, what does it matter? It doesn't really matter. There has to be like other ways of thinking of what's a successful artistic career. And that's kind of what I'm trying to think around, is like, how do I and my peers and my colleagues, how do we build some other kind of value system that makes art making somehow like actually meaningful? Because I do believe in art, but I don't believe in the art world being like, I mean, they're selling, like, it's all about selling stuff. And then on the other hand, there's this academia that's almost as commercialized, you know, like, so there's like, where is the space for art as this radical thing? So yeah, I guess that's kind of what I'm hoping for, is that in the face of this urgency, we would also come up with some other way of thinking of success as artists, and not kind of lean to the same thing. I have students at NYU who are kind of like, I'm trying to wake them up to thinking of what it is to be political. They don't want to do political art. They want to, you know, make art, which is great and fine. But then I'm like, what do you like? Can you still imagine that this is the trajectory of your career? Is that you hope to be in Chelsea Gallery in 20 years? It's like Chelsea will be underwater. Like, seriously, like, you can't think in those, you know, like, you can't think in those ways. Like, we don't.
You can't replicate that anymore.
No,
that moment is gone.
Yeah, the future is not.
Unfortunately, or maybe not unfortunately, but that moment isn't here anymore with us.
Yeah.
No, this is beautiful, and I think it can apply to any other field as well. The old notions of success are gone, and it's time to face it. So grades don't matter. On that sweet note, I'm going to end this session and invite everyone to the reception outside. I forgot to thank Trish Stone, who organizes, who's the backbone of all the events, anything that's wonderful that's happening at Calit2. Thank you so much, Trish, for making that possible.
Thank you for me also.